Hello, everyone. We will wait a little bit until all of the people have been let into the room and then start today's webinar. So, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jonathan, and I'm pleased to host this webinar on the developmental outcomes and just transitions in sustainability transitions. This is part of a webinar series on the global dimension of sustainability transitions that I organized together with Huyven Gong, Markus Steen, and Mari Wadeberg. We are interested in this webinar series, and this has been the starting point of why we do this. First, to create a space for cross-fertilization, exchange, and debate to advance the understanding of sustainability transition processes and outcomes across space and scale between, on the one hand side, the sustainability transitions community, as well as on the other hand side, the GPN and GVC scholars. And then, of course, the intention here is also to generate conceptual inspiration for both communities, how they could potentially cross-fertilize conceptually, but potentially also with regards to empirical case studies. And in this regard, also this webinar series is one of several steps in developing a broader research agenda at the sustainability transitions and GPN GVC interface. This will be complemented, for example, or is complemented with a special issue in the journal Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions, as well as a special session at the upcoming IST conference in Zurich. Before we start, I would very briefly go through some practicalities. So please be informed that we are recording today's webinar in order to upload it on YouTube afterwards. If you would not like to be recorded, you're free to leave the meeting. Other than that, each presenter will have some time to present their research. And if you have questions, please ask them in the chat. I will then moderate it, and we will take all of the questions at the end of the webinar. The webinar today is our third webinar on developmental outcomes and just transitions. We have three speakers, namely Felix Dorn, Marta Lopez Cifuentes, and Ulrich Elmer Hansen. And we have another webinar upcoming on the 14th of April on GVC and GPN lens to understand geopolitical disruptions in sustainability transitions. So if you're interested in this topic, please also sign up for the last webinar. I will now very briefly introduce you to the three speakers. So on the one hand side, the first speaker will be Felix Dorn. He's a university assistant at Boco University in Vienna. He holds a PhD in geography from Innsbruck University, and his research focuses on the political ecology of decarbonization, particularly on critical raw materials and energy transformations in Latin America and Southern Europe. As our second speaker today, we have Marta Lopez Cifuentes. She holds a doctorate from Boco University, and in 2022, she was awarded an Erwin Schrödinger Fellowship by the Austrian Science Fund, which enables her to work as a visiting researcher at the Center for Environmental Sustainable at the University of Surrey in the UK. Currently, she's also based at Boco University, but a different department than Felix, where she serves as the principal investigator of the Austrian component of the Translocal Food Coalitions project, from which she also will present first empirical insights today. And as a last speaker today, we have Ulrich Hansen. He's an associate professor and head of section at the Technical University of Denmark. He holds a master's degree in economic geography and a PhD in innovation and development studies. And he's particularly interested in innovation and technological catch-up in green technologies based on theoretical frameworks such as GVCs, FDI, and sustainability transitions. I would now give the floor to our first speaker, Felix Dorn. We would be happy to hear you talk about the dark side of green GPNs.
Now, right? Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I want to present the findings from a paper published last year in the journal Geography, and I would like to start with this image here. A you woman standing on a sacred mountain in La Guajira in Colombia, looking over her territory. La Guajira is right now becoming one of the world's prime locations for wind energy. But this is, as I try to show with this image, not empty space, rather lived territory with social orders, ontology, land use practices. And my paper essentially asks what happens when wind energy production network touches ground here. So in January 2022, Colombia's former president Ivan Duque inaugurated the country's first utility-scale wind farm, climbing an 80-meter turbine to wave the national flag. And he proclaims Colombia and La Guajira as a leader of Latin America's energy transition. And La Guajira is Colombia's northernmost department, roughly 270,000 Guayú, the country's largest indigenous group. Since the 1990s, international studies by, for example, the German Development Agency GIZ and later also the state mapped the potential in that area. This mapping is already part of the story because it positioned La Guajira as a global hotspot for wind energy investment. And today, 57 wind farm projects by 17 corporations at various stages of development. But this patriotic inauguration that I've just shown you conceals the fact that the energy infrastructure had to be secured by the Colombian military prior to the event to protect it against sabotage. And protests and blockades by residents have paralyzed many of the projects under development, resulting in massive delays and increased costs. And this tension is essentially what my paper is about. How does a wind energy production network touch ground in La Guajira, and what happens when it does? And to answer this, I bring the global production network, the GPN approach, into conversation, the relational concept of territory. As you all know, GPN approach focuses on dynamic connections between actors, groups of actors, and spatial scales, linking distant places and people, with value, power, and embeddedness as sort of the core analytical categories. And the growing dark side literature has started to unpack how strategic coupling, the process through which local and regional assets get integrated into global production, uses exclusion, dispossession, and corporate capture. And this is really important work. It shows that this is not a neutral process, but as I argue, this largely stays at the level of distribution. So the question of who gets what. And in the case of La Guajira, that's not enough, because what's at stake is not only an uneven distribution of benefits, but rather the destruction of alternative ways of knowing and inhabiting territory. So to get at what the dark side literature misses, I bring GPN into conversation with territory, understood not as a fixed container, but as a more performative space continuously produced through social practices, power relations, and human, non-human interactions. And following Karim Pashou and others, I operationalized territory through 3 dimensions: material, ideological, and the political dimension. And that allows me to identify overlapping and conflicting territorialities. So the dominant territoriality of corporate state actors on the one hand, and the alternative territoriality of Guayú communities on the other. And it allows me to ask not only who loses, but why some of these conflicts are so fundamentally difficult to resolve. And well, the analysis draws on ethnographic fieldwork realized in 2023, 2024, including interviews with firms, government officials, Guayú communities, but also ethnographic stays in Guayú clans. Before turning to wind energy, a brief word on context, because we cannot understand the present without the past, obviously, and La Guajira has been an extractive frontier for centuries, and each boom promised development, but each left behind poverty and environmental degradation. I think one of the key projects to understand this is El Cercón that we see here on this image. It is Latin America's largest open pit coal mine and has been operating since the 1980s. And in that process, families have been relocated, rivers have been diverted. And that's the context into which wind energy now arrives, while coal mining continues for the moment, at least. And in the interest of time, I will now focus mostly on the territorial analysis and see what GPN scholarship can learn from that. So starting with the material dimension, companies and state actors consistently frame La Guajira as a baldío, as a wasteland, empty desert, available for development. But this is, as I try to show here, active pastoral landscape structured around water access and seasonal mobility with sheep and goat herds. And when I returned to visit a clan leader in 2024, she had relocated her entire household because there was, as she put it, not a single drop of water left. Water is not only scarce in that area, it has become a negotiation instrument because firms typically provide water supply to communities as a first step in consultation processes. And this may be well-intentioned, but it obviously creates new dependencies. And communities become sort of reliant on corporate goodwill for access to a basic need. And as I argue in the paper, is that this is basically existentialism and not development. But then at the same time, there's also what I would call maybe an electricity paradox, because the village just a few kilometers away from an operating wind farm is powered by a diesel generator for 5 hours a day. And one resident summarized this quite well. He said, for us, it's just a change from exporting coal to exporting wind. And the second dimension is ideological. And I think this is where we need to go beyond distribution, because for corporations, wind is essentially a performance parameter. So wind speed in meters per second, a regional asset to be quantified and positioned globally. And for wind, for the Wayuu, wind is, they call it Hoktai, a deity, a being with agency, accompanying fishermen, marking seasons, and so on. And this ontological difference goes further than wind itself. So GPNs fix space, they require stable property rights, defined boundaries, permanent infrastructure. And Wayuu territory is fundamentally fluid, marked by cemeteries where ancestors communicate, mobile with herds and water availability. And if an ancestor signals that a community must relocate, they relocate. So a wind turbine obviously cannot. And the director of the Superior Council of Palabreros put it, he is stating that if tomorrow they dream that, we dream that we have to go where there is a windmill, will they take down that windmill? No, they won't do that. So these are not just different interests, as it's often framed, but rather fundamentally different spatial logics. And the third and final dimension is political. Colombia has ratified the ILO Convention 169 and institutionalized prior consultation. And on paper, it is one of the more developed frameworks in Latin America, but there is a profound gap between formal requirements and practice. So companies often withhold environmental information, they negotiate with traditional rather than ancestral authorities, a distinction that matters enormously in Wayuu logics, and offer compensation rather than profit sharing. And many communities only eventually find out the actual size of a wind farm. So one clan leader said, for example, how can you agree to something if you don't have all the information? And in this context, another resident emphasized, wind energy will not change anything compared to coal. So it is very important to note that Wayuu communities are not homogeneous, and they are not a homogeneous group. And far from romanticizing Wayuu logics, some have agreed to wind farm construction and benefit from contracts with companies. But these persistent conflicts that do exist have had concrete consequences. So Enel abandoned a huge wind energy project after being able to work only around 48% of workdays in 2022, and since then, other companies followed. So to conclude, maybe I'll try to conclude with 3 contributions to GPN scholarship. So first, I think that this territorial lens reveals that ontological frictions fundamentally challenge assumptions about strategic coupling, because some territorial logics may be genuinely incompatible with integration into global production, and that cannot be resolved through better governance or more inclusive institutions alone. Second, the dark side of green GPNs extends beyond distributional concerns and corporate capture and encompasses, for example, the commodification of how I would call it, like ontologically contested resources and the systematic marginalization of alternative knowledge systems. Again, this is not about romanticizing indigenous resistance in Guajira communities. Some have agreed to wind farm construction, some benefit from contracts, and responses vary considerably across territories and clans. But what I'm arguing is that the ontological dimension is analytically necessary to grasp different understandings of development, territory, and resources. And third, and more broadly, GPN gives us the tools to analyze how La Guajira gets coupled into global production, who captures value, who bears risk. But territory gives us the tools to analyze how global production networks interact with divergent territorial logics and why some of the resulting conflicts are so fundamentally difficult to resolve. Okay, in case you're interested in reading the full paper, I've added a QR code here, and there's also a video I co-produced with 2 colleagues in case you want to watch the ethnographic portrait. I still have to add English subtitles, so for the moment it's only in Spanish. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for this presentation, Felix. Very insightful. Marta, you would be the next one to talk about your research.
Yes. You can see the slides.
Yes, everything perfect.
Perfect. So yeah, welcome also from my side. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper that it's not finalized like Felix. This is one that we are going to submit at the end of April. So we're also happy about any feedback or comments that you may have. And it's about the project Translocal Food Coalitions, as Jonathan mentioned, and our first findings regarding shaping alternative globalization through relational coupling in niche level global production networks. Also, a couple of my colleagues from the paper are here today, so if there are any clarification questions, maybe they can also answer in the chat. Also, the results that I'm going to present are preliminary. The final ones, we will have them for the IST conference in Zurich this summer. But yeah, I mean, the topic, it was already well introduced by Felix, but yes, again, so global production networks we know they're challenged by uneven distribution of benefits of globalization, as we have seen in the first presentation, also concentration of economic and political power, and the limited ability to respond to external shocks. And this is also very visible in agri-food systems, which are the ones that we're going to focus on in this paper. We have seen in agri-food system there are new models that are emerging and that they are claiming to be more environmentally sustainable. They promote social welfare, better working conditions, transparency, increases democratic control. And there is this also closer connection between producers, traders, retailers, consumers, not only in one region, which is more common in agri-food systems, but also across multiple localities. What remains unclear, however, is whether this new phenomena is really an alternative that challenges and transforms this conventional growth-oriented model, or is it another way of a greener ethical discourse. So the existing research that we have found often in an agri-food system often focuses on local niches, alternative food networks, and not so much on global production networks. So we saw a need also to better understand these trans-local niches operating globally. So our aim is to advance the understanding of these emerging phenomena and also the role or potential for sustainability transitions. For this, we focus on niche-level global production networks within the global food regime that we call translocal food coalitions, like the short name of the project. These are cross-border food commodity chains that work directly with producers and aim for fair value distribution, sustainable and democratic control. So the typical products here are chocolate, coffee, but also fruits and vegetables within Europe, but in different countries, for example. And for this, we suggest the novel concept of relational coupling to explore niche-level global production networks, which I will explain in a sec. So we've already heard about coupling in the first presentation, and here this is a very short overview of a strategic coupling as presented in the GPN literature. So it means how regions or actors align with global networks, and the main purpose is economic upgrading, value capture, competitiveness, and there's this mainly vertical coordination, local to global, and also often this power asymmetry driven by lead firms in these GPNs, global production networks. And then we'll have a structural coupling, which in the GPN literature is understood as a mode of a strategic coupling, and in the GIS literature is understood as its own coupling. But the main idea in any case is how innovation subsystems like knowledge, markets, legitimacy connect across scales globally. So the purpose here is to coordinate multi-scalar innovation and resource mobilization in multi-scalar system spanning coordination. And the focus here is mainly on knowledge and technology. So we see a lot of potential in these couplings, but when we were going to analyze, explore our translocal food coalitions, we saw that there was something missing, that it didn't allow us to really explore the alternativeness or how they want to transform the system. So we saw that they focus primarily on economic and technological outcomes, and they have less attention to the social, environmental, and ethical values, which may be present, but it's not the focus of this coupling. So we saw that these limitations are particularly evident at niche-level GPNs in sustainability transitions, because usually the coordination relies on horizontal relations and not so much on one lead company, for example, working vertically. It requires normative alignment and also mixed economic and non-economic resources. So it's not only about the market and the economy of the organizations. And so the current frameworks couldn't really capture these dynamics for us. So we decided to try and develop a new concept for coupling that we have called relational coupling. So this relational coupling, what we are trying to do is to explain how actors in different localities establish and sustain horizontal and translocal linkages. So the key linkages here is it comes from regions and subsystems to localities. It challenges national or purely system level approaches. So it's not just one country and another, but really the localities where the actors are placed. It focuses on socially embedded context of these actors. And also the values and norms are constitutive of these translocal food coalitions and not instrumental. So coupling is, we understand coupling here as a relational process, and it's collectively driven and also stabilized in these niche level GPNs. So to better understand the concept, we draw on coupling, these coupling limitations and the literature, as well as the proximity theory. And we have operationalized the concept in 3 dimensions. One is cognitive and normative alignment. The second is mobilization of mixed and economic and non-economic incentives. And the third is horizontal governance arrangements. I will come back to this and I will present it together with the results, but just very briefly, the methods, because this is also a bit of a limitation of this paper in particular. So we have done a mapping of 262 TLFCs, translocal food coalitions for Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. And we have analyzed the data in their websites. So it's really about how they present themselves. We did then an online survey, and only 63 participated, and it was a lot about organizational characteristics, sustainability practices, and challenges. And we also did 2 expert workshops. So the results that I'm presenting here are only the ones from the survey and the mapping of the website of these 63 TLFCs that also were analyzed that participated in the online survey. And then we use deductive coding based on the dimensions and inductive refinement for identification of new other patterns and additional dimensions. So some preliminary results and also the theoretical background for these dimensions. The first one, cognitive and normative alignment across translocal context. The theoretical conceptualization is that there is an alignment of values, norms, and shared understandings across localities, but these need to be actively constructed and negotiated among the actors that are in one country and the other, in one locality and the other. The empirical insights is the 2 main ones that we could identify, as there is a strong emphasis on self-positioning with sustainability discourse, emphasizing social responsibility and also broader societal goals beyond the organization itself and the partnership itself, so like climate change, climate justice, or global equity. And then also explicit expectations towards partners, so very normative alignment across these places, these localities, and also what we call relational values, so a lot of commitment towards fair labor, democratic organization, collaboration, respect, and transparency. These findings in this first dimension suggest that cognitive and normative alignment is multi-layered in these TLFCs. So it combines internal value articulation, outward projection toward partners, and also broader societal positioning. So rather than assuming pre-existing shared norms, the alignment appears to be actively constructed through discourse, also signaling the importance of value framing as a mechanism of relational coupling. Then the third one is the mobilization of mixed economic and non-economic incentives. So the theoretical understanding is the economic exchanges are embedded in broader ethical and social commitments, and is supported by the mobilization of material and normative resources. So for example, economic or material could be improved livelihoods and stabilize the production conditions in the producing localities, like, for example, offering above market prices, pre-financing or direct investments in the localities for the communities. And then the non-economic and the more intangible rewards that enhance the well-being, also the recognition and the ethical satisfaction of individual actors. So, for example, environmental stewardship, empowerment and recognition, skill development and capacity building, or long-term partnerships. Finally, the third dimension is horizontal governance arrangements. So the theoretical understanding is this distributive agency. It's very important for these translocal food coalitions so that it coordinates, the coordination emerges through these negotiating rules, mutual dependence, and shared responsibility rather than top-down. And empirical insights, we found 2 main results in this dimension. One is organizational arrangements and governance. So alternative ownership structures are quite common in TLFCs, like co-ownership, where the farmers co-owned the organization or the company, or cooperatives, also internationally, and participatory decision making. And then also these translocal partnerships, they give a lot of value to partnerships so that they are direct and long-term relationships with partners or producers, supported also by coordination mechanisms like training, consultancy, knowledge exchange, joint projects, certification, and not only official certification, but also internal standards. We also found some emerging dimensions from the inductive analysis, like, for example, the political engagement. So TLF6 act as agents for systemic change. They critique dominant global trade structures and build translocal networks for transformation. And then the second one is more the personal and social ties. So a lot of these TLFCs are shaped or emerge through immigration histories, personal experiences, or family and cultural connections. So some preliminary conclusions. The framing of a specialty in sustainability transitions in GPNs is really important for this kind of research, moving beyond from local niche, beyond this duality of local niche versus global regime towards transition unfolding also through translocal network configurations like TLFCs, and also our extending of the coupling concept, so challenging the focus on economic upgrading and system analysis, alignment through this relational coupling as a complementary perspective for the niche level GPNs. So it highlights normative alignment, the horizontal governance, and the mixed resources as central mechanisms. We suggest alternative pathways for some democratic and sustainable globalization, but there is, of course, further research needed. This is a first exploratory study, more empirical foundation from different sectors, and also theoretical development. Thank you very much for your attention, and you can follow the project in LinkedIn or our website.
Thank you very much, Marta, for this perspective and highlighting the role of translocal food coalitions. So now we have the last presenter of today, Ulrich. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see this?
Yes, it works.
Okay,
Perfect.
thank you. And thanks a lot for inviting me to give a presentation here to the organizers. The title of my presentation is The Industrial Return on Sustainability Transition in Developing Economies. And I'm going to get back to you in a second what I mean by that. As mentioned initially, I have mostly been working from this, you could say, development studies perspective, focusing a lot on latecomer catch-up. And my interest there is really sort of digging into a long-standing tradition about how developing economies can catch up, yeah, and at a firm level and at an industry level and at a country level. So this is a sort of a longer-term research agenda. And then you can say that investments in renewable energy have been growing a lot, especially and including in the global south. And my focus there, and then basically to ask the question about, so given this transition, would it be possible for developing economies to capture value in this transition? So that means promoting domestic manufacturing, creating jobs, making technological progress through knowledge transfer, and you can say reaching more broad development objectives. And this is a question that has been sort of very intriguing to me and that I've pursued since my PhD some years back. And I think most of you know, and maybe also have been studying this yourself, about the sort of exceptionally successful example of China, you could say developing internationally competitive industries in several green technologies like solar PV, electric vehicles, wind, batteries, and so on. So I'm not going to go so much into that, but more to say that I'm going to give you a picture of something else from some of our research projects in other developing economies in Asia and in Africa that you could say shows a little bit more of a nuanced picture compared to this Chinese success case. And what we've done is through several research projects looking into specifically about the importance of industrial policies, domestic market formation, technology transfer, also firm level research, just basically covering a lot of things in these projects. So I'm going to give you 3 examples from South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam, and it's going to be quite empirical, so not that theoretical. So we've had actually 2 separate projects in South Africa where we have been looking into the development of domestic manufacturing of wind turbines. And some of you may know that in South Africa there is the so-called REAP program, which is an auction-based tender scheme for large renewable energy projects. And it was held some years back over several sort of bidding rounds from 2011 to 16. Then it stopped, and then it started again in 2019. And what was quite interesting there was that actually the market for these, especially onshore wind projects, were growing over time across these auction bidding rounds. And you had what is called local content requirements. Probably some of you are familiar with this, used as a kind of industrial policy to promote domestic manufacturing. And what the government did was to enforce minimum threshold requirements for local content that was sort of gradually increasing over time. And what we saw there was a quite interesting increase in the average local content of projects, up to around 50%, domestic manufacturing of towers and foundation and anchor cages and so on. And what is interesting there is that you saw this kind of parallel development of a domestic market and domestic manufacturing, right? And that sort of happened until a period of time until the utility company Eskom basically stopped signing contracts, and then you could say the market stopped at that point in time. And that also meant that most of these foreign wind turbine manufacturers, they eventually canceled plans for localizing further component production and higher value added components like blades and so on. And then when this program restarted again in 2019, it's quite difficult to sort of restart a localization process. So in many ways, perhaps you could say a missed window of opportunity there. Then another project similar to this one that we've been running in Indonesia, we've looked into the domestic manufacturing of solar PV modules. And this may sound a little bit strange now that we know that China is pretty much controlling most of the value chain for solar PV. But back then in around 2011, I would say, the industry was not as consolidated as it is now. So several countries in Asia and elsewhere started to sort of look into promoting domestic manufacturing, and especially in Indonesia, this was actually a quite ambitious strategy. So already in 2015, the government put forward a roadmap that would, in 10 years' time, you could say, increase local production of pretty much everything, everything from, solar module assembly to cell to wafer to ingot and even mining, right? So quite an ambitious plan at that point. And again, you had these local content requirements in place to support that. And you also had two state-owned companies created to sort of be front runners to promote the industry. And a domestic manufacturer association was created for the government to sort of stay in touch with the movement on the ground. So quite interesting and quite ambitious. And of course, if you are relying on the domestic market to promote domestic manufacturing, you need the market to grow. But what we saw in the case of Indonesia was that over this period of 10 years, you only saw a total installed capacity of solar of about 300 megawatt, and this is of course very, very small market. And the main reason for this was that there is a great deal of uncertainty for investors, mainly due to a lot of overlapping and frequently changing energy policies. So what that all meant was that although some domestic manufacturers actually started producing solar PV modules, it was only sort of small volumes and running below full capacity levels, and most of them sort of, adopted a wait-and-see approach and then eventually decided to leave the industry. So again, perhaps you could say a missed window, but a lot of very good intentions. The final example here is from a project that we are running now in Vietnam, where we are looking into a similar story about domestic manufacturing of solar PV modules. And what is quite interesting there is that we've seen quite a substantial amount of investments from Chinese companies going into solar PV cell and module production not only in Vietnam, but also in Malaysia and in Thailand and in other countries. Yeah. And what we have seen is that they move there in order to sort of circumvent trade regulation, mainly in the US, which is the main export market. So the US has implemented import tariff and anti-dumping duties and so on. And so a lot of these very large factories have been located in what's called special economic zones in Vietnam, where companies are able to pay a lower corporate income tax, and they're also exempted from value-added tax on imported components and so on. So when doing field work in Vietnam, we were able to visit many of these very large factories, and of course, a lot of this is highly automated production, and most of the local labor is involved in, you could say, final assembly, final packaging, sort of the lower value-added activities in the factories. And what we also see is there's pretty much a lack of linkages to local suppliers and components of services. And that means that these factories, they sort of operate mostly as sort of isolated enclaves where you have imported components that are assembled locally and then they are exported out of Vietnam. So that means that it's not a great benefit necessarily for Vietnam to have, being sort of embedded in these production networks like this. And what we also see now is that Vietnam is now being included under these US trade regulations from last year. And that means that the companies are then moving further out into other countries, to Laos and to Indonesia and elsewhere. And one of the reasons for this is that it's a very lucrative business. So break even on these factory investments are only around 2-3 years. So investments are already paying back. So factories are relatively easy to move again. And that's of course, you could say, the nature of this industry, which is quite footloose. And for that reasons, it probably also kind of a slippery window of opportunity for promoting long-term development in this green industry. So that's the 3 sort of examples empirically. And my final slide here is just to try to draw some general conclusions on that. And of course, as you can see, it's not easy to replicate China's success in these industries, and that's okay, so to say. You can still have sort of domestic development to some extent, perhaps. It's also very clear that some of these windows are definitely closing as industries they are consolidating, like solar and PV and wind and so on. And then you see new windows opening, like green hydrogen, which is a lot of research going into right now. And of course, as we also see here, a lot depends on policy making, policy design, or policy coordination, and so on. But it's also, of course, very tricky, and that also depends on whether you are sort of pursuing a very sort of inward-oriented strategy, where you're depending very much on domestic market growth, or whether you're promoting, you could say, a more outward-oriented strategy, like in Vietnam, where the strategy is basically about linking up to global value chains and hopefully engaging in upgrading over time. And of course, as we've seen here, the devil is very much in the details. There's a lot of specific contextual elements, which of course means that we have a lot of exciting research to do here from my perspective. Okay, that's all from me. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ulrich, as well. Very insightful, interesting, and very complementary presentations, I think. Different contexts, different, kind of like parts that bring together a nice overview of the topic. Are there any questions from the audience? Please note them down in the chat. Otherwise, maybe I can start with a question to you, Felix. You talked a lot about, kind of like ontological differences and these kind of like stuff. Do you have any ideas about how the kind of like conflicts that, of course, this brings with, how they could be mitigated in a way, potentially against the idea of a just transition?
Should I answer right away, or should we collect a bit?
Yeah, please feel free to answer, I think, while we wait for
Yeah.
others to note down questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this focus this focus on ontologies might allow us to rethink the relationships between companies and communities that we observe so far, and this includes the entire consultation process. So this legal way of approaching communities today, and obviously communities are heterogeneous actors, but I think underlying that is the question of what do we foreground in these processes. And right now that is at best value and value distribution. And I think we could include forms of knowing relating to nature that could include different ways of planning, and maybe making different actors stakeholders. I hate the word, but make them stakeholders in the process, and include them not only by consulting with a finished or already designed project, but yeah, obviously that would all be quite ambitious and costly, and that's certainly why it's not done so far. But I think that would be a good way to frame that. I don't think that these incompatibilities or incommensurabilities would not allow for designing projects. I think we just have to rethink the process.
Thanks a lot for this. Then I think we have a question from Stina about, this is to you, Ulrich. From your research, what are the development implications of the closing of green windows following geopolitical shifts?
I think that's a very good research question, actually. But I think that when we at least when we look to this solar PV story, which is just changing so fast. I mean, we're talking about maybe 10, 15 gigawatt solar factories, huge investments, and they are installed and erected in 2-3 years time. I mean, that's how fast it's going, right? It's a little bit mind-boggling, and I have to say that I really feel that these windows of opportunity in a sector like that, which I mean in some ways is similar to, I don't know, textiles and garments, but even there changes may not have happened that fast. So it's really a good question, and I think the development implications of windows that are so short in time and so rapidly changing, at least for a sector like that, may not be that big. It might be different other sectors, and maybe that are maybe not that geopoliticized even.
Thanks a lot. We have another question from Ibrahim about the question whether, from a GPN perspective, and this is now to the three of you, do you see any developmental outcome trajectories emerging from these new GPNs in host regions tailored to sustainability transitions as compared to the status quo? Who wants to start? Felix, you want to start?
I don't know if I want to start, but I can certainly if, yeah. So maybe adding to what I just said, I think in my case, like the very big omnipresent question is what development actually means for different groups. And I think that is something to be considered in sustainability transitions, which is quite essential. Obviously, I don't know if we do need GPN for that, right? I mean, we could add this question by, I don't know, combining political ecology and sustainability transitions. But the doing or realizing a GPN analysis in my case has at least shown that there was a certain need to extend that. So I think the question of what development means for different groups is sort of my takeaway from the case I analyzed.
I can continue maybe.
Should be, yeah.
Well, the host regions, I was struggling with this because for us, we look at organizations that are based in Europe but work with producers based in other countries, particularly in the global south, but also in southern and eastern Europe. So what we've done so far, as I said, is just looking at what they are saying about themselves in websites. Of course, they always say, yeah, that is how we improve the situation or the sustainability in these localities, in these communities usually. And now we just started with the case study. So we have now 9 case studies, and a colleague, Sarah, I think she's somewhere here in the audience, was just in Mexico looking at one of these communities with the coffee chains, for example, and the producers that were really seeing the positive impacts that these kind of organizations had for them, and these kind of global production networks that really try to link 2 localities in a more horizontal and fair and just way than what they are used to in the global market with the status quo. And I think what we've seen so far from our very preliminary results is that they do have an impact on very local communities. We don't know if they have an impact on regions or at national level on sustainability transitions yet. And then it's also the question if they have an impact on the host region, so in Europe, because these are usually products that are more expensive than the ones that we're used to find in the supermarket. These products like coffee, chocolate, or vegetables that come from fairer global production networks. So this is something that we would also like to look at this consumption perspective, but that we haven't done yet. So this is something that could also be very interesting on how I don't like the in how it translates into the global production networks in Europe then.
Do you want to answer this as well, Ulrich?
Yeah, I can maybe chip in, and I think it's a very good question again. And I think maybe what is also meant here is sort of, can we see some general trends? I mean, which way is this sort of going, so to say? And I think that's fundamentally, I think that's an interesting research question again, whether hosting regions can capture value and retain value from a sort of classical GPN GVC perspective, right? And of course, this is also to, you could say, avoid somehow that GPNs or GVCs they not only sort of touch down somewhere and without actually creating beneficial development outcomes for the hosting communities, whether this is in Southern Europe or in the global South or somewhere else. And at least for my own research, I think that what we are seeing is that although it's not sort of we're probably not going to see South Africa becoming the new big hub of wind turbine innovation and manufacturing. There can still be a lot of local job creation and business development and learning and technology transfer from a sustainability transition happening locally. And I think that's worthwhile exploring from a research point of view. But I don't think, at least from my own research, that we see sort of a very clear-cut trends where this is going somehow.
Thanks a lot. Then we have 2 questions for you, Marta, in particular. One related to whether you could expand a little bit on what you mean by niche level GPNs. And then another one, what do the forms of relational couplings that you have observed in these niche GPNs mean for their scaling potential? And what would be the main scaling logic? I think that's maybe particularly interesting also vis-a-vis, existing global value chains in the food and agriculture context, and to what extent they would be potentially able to replace these, or how the competition maybe unfolds here, etc.
Yeah, I think, and the two questions are also quite related on why did we use these niche level GPNs? Because we saw that global production networks are usually more like you were saying, competitive, industrialized, global production networks in agri-food systems that we see every day, that we see all the products in the supermarkets. Whereas this niche level, we wanted to make this niche level so that it's clear that these are alternative global production networks, smaller, that they are trying to change the global production networks in larger scale, that these more industrialized global production networks that we know. This is why we call it niche level, so more alternative, smaller, more focusing on this horizontal, on these relations, direct relations between the localities, among the different actors involved in the global production network. And then hailing. This is something that we've been discussing in the project. This is also a transdisciplinary project, so we have 7 companies also working with us, and scaling is a big question for them, of course. It's a big question for us. How can we do it? We have one company from the Netherlands called Trading Organic. I don't know if maybe some of you know it. And they're quite big, actually. They have made it, they have made it bigger, at least. The other ones are quite small, and there are some big companies, but for example, for the case studies, none of the big companies wanted to participate in the project, so it's difficult for us to talk about this scaling up when all the companies that we have are quite small, are quite struggling with this market dynamics, with the competition, with also the prices. What I was saying, these products are very expensive in Europe, so who's going to buy them? And this is, a question that it's still open in the project. We don't have results on scaling potential just yet. I have to be honest. This is just a question that we've discussed internally, so I cannot give an answer to that directly. But yeah, this is we've seen it. I mean, with Tony Chocolani, for example, it's a chocolate that it follows our niche level logic, and they have made it to quite big markets. How we can relate it to our relational coupling concepts this is a new concept that we just developed. We don't know just yet. Sorry.
Are there other questions? Yes, there's one from Marcus.
Yeah, I'll just put it out in words instead of writing. So, question to Ulrich. So, would the kind of conclusion from what you said be that countries should consider technology characteristics carefully in their industrial policies for kind of green catch-up strategies?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a good conclusion on my presentation for sure. And as I mentioned also that some windows might be more opportune to pursue at this point in time, given where the technology is going and its state of development and its characteristics and so on. So very good.
Great. So I think we have come to the end of today's webinar. Thanks a lot, Marta, Ulrich, and Felix. Very insightful presentations. I think we had a very interesting discussion as well. Thanks a lot for sharing these insights. And yes, for those of you that were listening to today's webinar, we have another webinar that is coming up, scheduled for the 14th of April, in which we pay more attention towards geopolitical disruptions, the geocommunization, and what all of this means for sustainability transitions, but also how GVC and GPN perspectives could actually contribute and provide new lenses to study these issues within the context of transitions. Thanks a lot for participating today, and see you in, I think it's 3 weeks.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.